In later years, Houston would be credited with transforming the women's movement from the heads of an activist few to the hearts of the populist many. But despite the truth of all this, the beginning of my even greater learning started at Houston, and it came from those women from Indian country, completely unanticipated by me. If movements are about imagining what could be, they were the start of my 30 years of much bigger and deeper imagining. I might have missed this altogether had I not been recruited as a kind of scribe by the women of color caucuses who were redrafting what was then called the Minority Women's Resolution. It had come up from each state, but there Asian Americans had been as far apart as Hawaii and New York. The Hispanic caucus meant Chicanas on one coast and Puerto Ricans and Cubans on the other. And the 300 members of the Black Women's Caucus came from every city and from the rural South. Though the American Indian Alaskan Native Caucus represented less than 1% of the population, at least according to the notorious undercount of the census, they also were the most geographically spread out. But now, with all these caucuses in one place, they could work together on a substitute resolution, but only in the early mornings and late nights when there was no voting on the floor. My job was to go from one caucus to the next, one hotel meeting room to the next, writing down shared issues, appending those that were unique to each caucus, and drafting language for the approval of all. I was both honored to be what they referred to with humor as our token, and scared shitless that I wouldn't be able to fulfill the trust of those women I'd worked with before and who had gone out on a limb to recommend me. Looking at those rooms full of women sitting on every surface and consuming, I have to say, Houston's worst coffee and pizza, I could see just how much diversity was being brought together. Among African American delegates alone, for instance, there were legislators who knew parliamentary procedure cold and women who had never been to a conference before, union organizers and business owners, deltas in silk dresses and teenagers in army boots, civil rights veterans and college students who considered themselves much too radical to vote. To their issues of racial bias, the Asian Pacific American Caucus added the problems of language barriers, sweatshops, and the isolation of women who arrived as servicemen's wives. Hispanic women who were coming together as a caucus for the very first time, which was in itself historic, that large different groups, Cuban, Chicanas, Puerto Ricans, came together as a Hispanic caucus for the very first time. They spoke for Chicana mothers deported away from their children, a problem that we have at this very moment in time. Puerto Ricans treated as if they were not US citizens, and Cubans suffering from US tensions with Cuba. American Indian and Alaskan Native delegates spoke for the poorest and least employed of any ethnic group, and also the only one whose children were still coerced into religious boarding schools far from their own families and their own communities. The Indian delegates were the fewest, but they also had the most educating to do. Other women of color focused, for instance, on breaking down barriers into the mainstream, but they worked for sovereignty outside the mainstream. When they spoke of termination, meaning the threat to end treaties, other delegates thought they meant opposition to abortion. An irony, since Native delegates were also protesting the sterilization of 40% of their sisters, 40%, by government-funded health services with or without their informed consent. And so they had special reason to value reproductive freedom as a human right. So as one of them said, if we speak on the floor about whaling rights, will you think we mean the right to cry? I began to see just how little Native issues were understood and just how much they needed a sense of humor in order to survive. And actually, that's the one thing that everyone shared, and I shared with them, was wondering just how long we could keep going without sleep. Delegates were almost ready to vote on the minority resolution when representatives of all the caucuses approved its expanded substitute in a windowless courtroom backstage at the Coliseum. Is the Coliseum still there? No? A chosen spokeswoman from each caucus rushed to stand around a microphone on the floor, and each one read her part of this resolution. At the end, the very last speaker was Coretta Scott King, who stood with her bodyguard, a reminder of past tragedy, as she read the Black Caucus statement on racial realities in education, health, housing, and salaries. Then she asked that the entire Minority Women's Resolution be adopted by acclamation. What seemed to be all 2,000 delegates stood to shout yes, even including one man and one woman from the Mississippi delegation that had been taken over by the Ku Klux Klan. "Let this message go forth from Houston and spread all over this land," Coretta said. "There is a new force, a new understanding, a new sisterhood against all injustice." As if by magic, somebody started to sing "We Shall Overcome," and soon the whole Coliseum was joining hands and voices and singing together. It was definitely the high point of the conference.
Hi, thanks for watching. I'm Randall Morton, founder of the Progressive Forum. We're building a worldwide progressive mission featuring great minds like the one you just saw. If you'd like to join our mission, please donate today. Thanks again.